What's happening, folks? So we're going to talk insulin today. Insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. These are two terms that you'll hear me throw around quite regularly. You'll also hear probably a lot of other trainers. You'll see it on Instagram, on TikTok, maybe on YouTube if you watch YouTube. You may even hear it from some medical professionals. But what I want to try to explain today is allow you to understand it in layman's terms and also how it is relevant to what we do. We're not going to go off down into so many rabbit holes, but how it's relevant to a transformation, body composition, and optimal health. Now, just before I do that, I'm currently sick as a dog. So if I break out into coughs in the middle of this, I apologize. If my voice sounds a little bit weird, again, I apologize. So, first things first, insulin. What is it? Insulin is a hormone that allows your body to clear your bloodstream essentially of sugar, of glucose. If you have high glucose levels in your bloodstream, chronically especially, it becomes very, very toxic, very, very dangerous, and it can even kill you if those levels remain too high for too long. Hence, diabetes, very, very bad cases of diabetes. So insulin is a hormone that helps to clear the body or clear the bloodstream of elevated glucose levels. So what I want you to think about with that is imagine insulin, forgive my crude drawings, is a key. Insulin is a key. So if we drill that into the brain now, insulin is a key that unlocks a door. Insulin is a key that unlocks the door. Go through that in your brain as many times as you need to right now to remember that, because it's going to help you out in a minute. Now, with insulin, as I mentioned a second ago, it's going to help to lower levels of blood glucose. So if we imagine in the bloodstream, in here we have glucose. Let's just use that, nice pretty color. Glucose, glucose, lots of it, glucose, glucose, glucose. Now, our blood glycogen or glucose levels, glycogen later on, are going to be in reference to the amount of food we're taking in potentially. It could be stress hormones, but again, we're going to keep it simple. The primary sources of food that are going to elevate blood glucose are number one, I'm pretty sure you probably already know it, carbs. Option number one. Secondly, protein. Okay, protein. So, when you are taking carbohydrates in your diet, blood glucose is going to go up. Now, it's going to go up relevant to how much carbohydrate you take in any given sitting, what type of carbohydrates they are, and how damaging or not damaging that may be to you, or how much it may affect you, is going to be down to loads of stuff. Genetics, the amount of muscle tissue you have, when you last trained, all of these types of things. But primary source of blood glucose is carbohydrates. Secondary source of blood glucose is protein. The body can turn protein into glucose to be used for fuel. So, for example, if we're on a low carb diet, we're not taking a lot of carbohydrates from our diet, we need to increase the amount of protein we take in during that. Otherwise, we're going to break down loads of muscle tissue and we're not really going to be able to get the body recomposition we want. Yes, we may lose weight, but there's a pretty good chance we're also going to be losing loads of muscle. If we lose loads of muscle, that's also going to mean that we are slowing our metabolism down. So this is why it's important not to take away an entire macronutrient. Our body still needs carbohydrates. The amount is going to be relevant to your insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity, which is going to take a bit of experimentation. Excuse me, but in the absence of carbs, your body can also use dietary protein or muscle protein in the absence of dietary protein. So it will break down muscle tissue to make glucose. Right, so that essentially is where the glucose is coming from. That is why it is in our bloodstream. Insulin, if we imagine, attached to your bloodstream, we have basically, it's very crude, obviously, but let's see how we go. I want you to imagine that these things here are muscle cells. This is the muscle. Imagine this like a fuel tank. Fuel tank for muscle. Okay? So imagine that. This is a muscle cell. This is a fuel tank in it. Now, remember what I said earlier. Say it over in your head. Insulin is a key. Okay? Insulin is a key. So, when there is elevated levels of glycogen in the bloodstream, glycogen is high, the pancreas will release insulin because it knows that if this stays elevated, it becomes dangerous. It's not good for the body. Okay, so blood glucose levels are high, pancreas releases insulin. Now remember what we said, insulin is a key. So insulin comes in. Wow. And what it does essentially is it unlocks the door. Okay, it unlocks the door of all of these cells, therefore allowing glucose to go in. Right? So, elevated blood sugar, insulin is released. Insulin acts as a key, essentially unlocks the door to allow uptake of glucose into the muscle tissue, into the fuel tank. So, over time, this then fills up, okay? And obviously, as it's taking that in, it's also taking other nutrients, it's taking protein, all of these types of things, okay? So this is a very, very useful, very, very good process within the body. Now, that essentially is going to explain how insulin works. Now, if you are insulin sensitive, what it is usually going to mean is that the key, insulin, is effective. It works. Key is effective. It works. I can unlock that door. I can shuttle loads of fuel into these muscle cells. Now, insulin resistance, i.e. you do not respond to insulin. This is responsive. Insulin resistance is when your body is no longer responding to that insulin. The key is going into the door, but it is not able to put anything inside. It's not able to unlock it, okay? Key goes into the door, not able to unlock it. That is insulin resistance. When the key is able to unlock the door and fill the muscle cell, that is insulin sensitivity. So the more insulin sensitive you are, the better. The more insulin resistant you are, the worse. It essentially means you're not going to deal with carbohydrates well. You'll end up with elevated levels of blood sugar. Now, everybody falls somewhere within a continuum on that. So now we'll look at insulin resistance. One of the main causes of insulin resistance is going to be, if we look at these cells, this here, we have right here a full cell. We're taking in loads of carbohydrates in our diet, loads and loads of carbohydrates. So this is always full. It's always up to the brim. So we've taken in more food, more carbohydrates, more protein, whatever it may be, too big a portion, blah, blah, blah. Blood glucose is elevated. Insulin releases into the bloodstream to unlock this door. But tries to unlock it. Sorry, mate, we're already full. You're not coming in. Nothing left in here. There's no space. We're at capacity. Goes to the next one. Sorry, mate, we're full. You're at capacity. This becomes a problem because we are now resistant to that key, potentially because we are taking in too many carbohydrates or not using those carbohydrates for fuel, for weight training, etc., etc., etc. So instead of being insulin sensitive and us being able to shuttle loads of glycogen into the system, we can't do it because these are already full. This then starts to create a big problem. In a calorie surplus especially, this is then going to be stored as fat because it needs to be taken away somehow to get it out of the system, right? So that's insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity in a nutshell. Now, what are the things that affect that? Let's wipe all of this down. So what we do know is that if we have that cell full, this doesn't seem to want to clear, maybe it's my hands, there we go, now we're getting it. So we know that insulin sensitivity is when that key is going to be effective to unlocking that cell. So if we want to make sure that that muscle cell, if we remember, is responsive to the key, we need to make sure that this cell is not always overflowing. So there's a few things we can do with that. When we are taking in our food, especially carbohydrates, it's making sure that we're having the right amount of carbohydrates in a sitting or in a day, for example, to fill that muscle cell up, but not completely. So we can still use the key, it's still effective on that muscle cell, okay? So we can fill it up, but not completely. If we overfill it, it becomes less responsive to that key. If that happens chronically over time, there is a problem. So one option is to ensure we're monitoring our portions, not taking in too big a portions of, say, for example, carbohydrates at any given time. The second option is to slow down the speed at which that fills up. Okay, and you can do that nutritionally, not only by having smaller portions, but for example, if you have high glycemic index carbs, things like white rice, bread, these types of things, that's going to fill up super fast. If you take in low GI carbs, things like oats, things like sweet potatoes, that's going to fill up a lot slower. Okay, so as it's filling up, you're doing stuff day to day, maybe you're training, you're walking, you're doing day-to-day activity. So it's kind of filling up as quickly as you're emptying it again. Okay, so that's one option, is we can take in low GI carbs to prevent this from bumping up so fast. Second thing, if we take carbohydrates in with good fats, things like avocados, oils, again, it slows down the release, not so much of this part, but if we go back to the bloodstream, fats slow down the digestion of other foods. So potentially, instead of there suddenly being loads and loads and loads of glucose in your blood over the space of, say, half an hour, that same amount of glucose is actually going to go in over the space of 3 hours, because we've slowed down the digestive process, which has reduced the speed at which blood glucose elevates, which allows insulin, our key, right here, to do its thing and let some glycogen into the muscle while the muscle is still using it day to day. Okay, so there's a couple of management strategies there. We reduce the amount of food we eat in any given sitting. We choose different types of carbohydrates, for example. We can potentially slow down the digestive system, preventing blood sugar spikes by taking in fats at the same time. So these are input, okay? If we're trying to slow down things going in. But what can we do to speed up things going out of that muscle cell? So all of this is fuel. This is lifting fuel. This is glycogen. This is what's going to help us get in the gym and squat and deadlift and bench press and do all of the fun things we do in there. So the primary way to increase insulin sensitivity, aside from your diet, the dietary input is effective for one side, but we also want to train. We do want to weight train. By weight training, we're emptying this much quicker, okay? This is coming down, allowing space for us to fill it back up. It's coming down, allowing space for us to fill it back up. This is why one of the quickest, most effective ways to improve your insulin sensitivity, diet aside, is to weight train. This is when you're going to use the most muscle glycogen, okay? Very, very, very important. Now, the same doesn't happen if you do things like cardio. If you're doing lots of steady state cardio, you're going to use a bit of glycogen, yes, but you're going to oxidize a lot of fatty acids as well. Whereas if we want to maximize our insulin sensitivity, which should be kind of goal number one for almost everybody, weight training is the key there. So let's recap on that. The input that we need to change. Input is we eat smaller portions. Smaller, we'll say carb portions, keep it simple. Portions. We make sure we are, what was my second one? Well, we'll go straight in. We can add fats to slow down digestion, to slow things down. We can choose low GI versus high GI, okay? So here are a few strategies on the input, the dietary input, to help manage insulin sensitivity. If we then want to go the output, i.e. we want to, let's say, it's easy, the output, which is essentially emptying, the emptying of the cell, weight training. This is our key to that. Now remember, the bigger the muscles you train, the harder you train, the heavier you train, the more fuel you are going to use. Consider those muscle cells like an engine, okay? They are an engine. The stuff inside them, this is fuel, our glucose, our glycogen. The size of the engine, the bigger the engine, the faster it's going to use that fuel. The smaller the engine, the slower it's going to use that fuel. So the more muscle you have, the more carbohydrates you're going to be able to take. The more muscle you have, the more carbohydrates you'll be able to take per sitting. The more muscle you have, the faster all of this is going to sort itself out. So our goal again should be to maintain or build as much muscle as possible whilst going through a transformation. So we want a big engine. We want to put the right fuel in, making sure things aren't overflowing in the right amounts. And we want to drive that bitch like we stole it. We want to burn fuel like crazy. Okay, so you weight train hard, you train big muscles. Bigger the muscle, the more fuel you're using, which is why it's important to squat, deadlift, do all of the hard stuff. Now, there's also some strategies that we can use that are a little bit more advanced with regards to optimizing insulin sensitivity. And one of my favorites is carb cycling. One of the best forms of advanced dieting you can do. Carb cycling. So, carb cycling essentially is on the days when you need it the most, i.e. heavy, hard weight training days. We eat more carbs on those days, which means we fill this up, and we eat as close to the limit as possible, because we know that our output is super high, and we're gonna deplete that. We're gonna empty it really fast. We're gonna use that fuel really, really quickly because we're training super hard. Then on the rest days, we eat way less carbs, so we're not overflowing, okay? Essentially what that's gonna mean is that on the days where we need it, we eat loads more, i.e. blood sugar is higher, insulin's doing its thing. On the days when we don't, we eat less, and essentially it results in this never quite overflowing, and certainly not, excuse me, this never quite overflows, it never spills over the top, because on the days where we put loads in, we also use loads. On the days where we're not putting many in, obviously it's going to be below the plumb line anyway, it's going to be below level, we're not having any problems. Okay, so carb cycling is a great way to do that. We fill it up when we're going to use the most, then when we're not going to be using much, we don't put quite so much in, prevents any overflow, but it's going to maximize our, excuse me, it's going to maximize our energy, it's going to maximize our ability to lift, it's going to help us mentally, it's going to help us socially, because we're going to eat different types of foods. Okay, so many strategies for managing insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. The keys are managing, as we said, your nutrition, the input, also managing the output, i.e. the weight training. We can then use advanced dietary strategies like carb cycling, where you're going to put more in on certain days, less in on other days. All very, very effective ways to do it. Now, why is insulin sensitivity important? Remember, insulin sensitivity is the key being effective to let nutrients in. First off, because if you are insulin resistant chronically, long term, it's very, very dangerous. You do not want that to happen. You know, you can die from very, very severe cases of diabetes. You don't want that. So first off, health and longevity. We talk about longevity, anti-aging. Glucogenic stress or high levels of blood sugar chronically damages the body. It will make you age much, much, much faster. Anyone out there with PCOS, this type of thing, you will suffer from these type of things. It's very, very important that you take this in and you understand why it is important that you maintain some level of insulin sensitivity. If we talk about managing stress, your body will have an inverse relationship between cortisol and insulin. So if we always have loads and loads and loads of glucose in the system because we're overeating on carbohydrates or we're not training enough, all of these types of things, when glucose is high, insulin will be released. Insulin will be high. Okay? If insulin is always high, if there is a problem, eventually cortisol is going to be released to bring insulin back down and vice versa, and you end up with this cascade of up and down stress hormones all of the time. Again, we don't want that. It's going to cause anxiety. It's going to cause potentially your body storing fat. It's going to cause muscle tissue breakdown. It's going to cause cellular breakdown, excessive cellular oxidation. So again, you're going to age quicker. We want to keep our cortisol levels under control, and insulin is kind of the counteracting hormone to that. So we need to keep insulin under control in order to be able to do this. Cortisol will elevate when all of this is going on. That's cortisol. Let's go cortisol there. Forgive the writing. Cortisol will elevate to try and get rid of some of this. We'll try to get rid of it and get it out of the system. Okay? So we don't want those ups and downs happening. When it comes to building muscle, carbohydrate intake is extremely important to build muscle, because if you remember, one of the things I said is that in order to, well, one of the jobs of insulin is to unlock that muscle cell. Okay, so insulin shows up. Here's our little key. It shows up, opens the door, and allows what's in the bloodstream, in the case of say carbohydrates, etc., but also if we've got protein, anything we've digested, all of this stuff, carbs, protein, nutrients, vitamins, all of this type of stuff, insulin allows that to go into the muscle. So if you're trying to build muscle, maintain muscle, you're shuttling all of the other nutrients in there as well. Everything you need is going in, and this is the key. Insulin is the key that unlocks the door, that allows all of that stuff to go into the muscle cell where it is needed, where it's going to be used, and where it's going to make you feel absolutely epic. So if you are insulin resistant, none of this is happening well either. So when you're trying to build muscle, of course you want to shuttle as much protein, very specifically, into that muscle to make it grow. So if you're not insulin sensitive, by the time you're trying to put on loads of muscle, that is a problem. This is again one of the reasons why we will always try and get someone nice and lean first. We get them lean, get them shredded, get them insulin sensitive, because then we can use way more of these two, carbs and protein, way more effectively. But if we try and use loads of carbs, loads of protein, when we're not insulin sensitive, when we've got a problem with this one, instead of all of those nutrients being shuttled in, the carbs and protein, they're not, we end up with elevated blood glucose levels, we feel like shit, we're not putting on much muscle, we're probably storing, especially all the glycogen, we're storing it as fat, it's overflowing, becoming fat, because if we're trying to build muscle, you're probably in a calorie surplus. So instead of using that food effectively to build muscle, you're actually storing fat and building almost no muscle at all because you were not insulin sensitive to start with. So you see there's a huge amount of things that rely on good levels of insulin sensitivity. Now, a load of you out there are saying, yeah, well, maybe I kind of get this now, I understand it a little bit better, but what's right for me? Ultimately, there is no answer there. There is no answer. The majority of you are going to be able to benefit from not a low carb diet or a zero carb diet. Common misconception, zero carb diets very rarely work. Yes, can they be done for a week or so to potentially improve short-term insulin sensitivity? Yes, they can. However, if it's long-term, stress hormones go through the roof, all of this stuff actually becomes very, very counterproductive because cortisol, again, as I say, cortisol and insulin are up and down all over the place. If you're constantly low carb, you don't have enough insulin, cortisol is likely to be chronically high, causing you all kinds of problems hormonally, physically, mentally, emotionally, etc., etc. So what we need to do is figure out what the right amount of carbohydrates for you is, and that's going to take some experimentation. I would say generally a low carb diet would be about 1 gram per kilo of total body weight. And I'm talking that'd be super low, potentially 1 to 1.5. No one should really be going below that. Now, what you would then do, dependent on your levels of insulin sensitivity, even if you were going low, is make sure you're picking the right food. So for example, anyone out there, we mentioned PCOS earlier. Anyone out there has PCOS. Yes, you can benefit from a low carb diet. However, that is not no carb, because again, one of your goals is going to be to control cortisol. You need to control your stress hormones, and you're going to need some carbohydrates to do that. You just need to have the right carbohydrates. We have low GI carbohydrates, all of these types of things. Okay, so the amounts are very, very difficult. I would say, as a starting point for most of you, 1 to 1.5 grams if you are choosing to go low carb. However, what I would say is if you are losing fat and or you are already lean, there's a fairly good chance you're pretty insulin sensitive, so you shouldn't have too much of an issue there, okay? That essentially is insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance in a nutshell, to try and help you understand, number one, what it is, number two, the context and why it's important to what we do when we do body recomposition, and number three, hopefully it's going to allow you to understand why it's important to weight training and to fat loss and to longevity and health. Remember, this is going to be a key to aging well and to be able to feel good while you're aging. Okay, so if you have any questions on that, I know it's a lot to take in. I've tried to be as visual as I can with explaining what it is. If you have any questions, wherever you're watching this, whether it be YouTube, on my online forums, anything like that, pop any questions below and I will cover it. If it's something that's worth me doing a bigger video, I'll cover it in video form. But that is insulin sensitivity in a nutshell. Enjoy.